Hello, extempers, speech and debaters, and everyone else. Welcome to this week's episode of The Half Hour. Today, we're going to be talking about the coup that happened on October 25th this year in Sudan. What's interesting about Sudan is they have a really interesting relationship with coups. It is not new to them. It is not something that happens out of random. It is very likely to happen. And they've had at least 5 in the last decade or so. But the most recent one so far, and what's interesting about it, is that in 2019, they finally were able to oust their previous leader, al-Bashir, and kind of start the transition into a Western democratic type of government. But because of recent incidents, the military of Sudan, who was sharing the government with the civilian coalition, started a coup, took that chance away, and here we are talking about this episode this week. I'm YuYu.
And I'm Spencer.
And let's just dive into it. There will probably be violence mentioned just because coups can get really bloody. And people really like to protest. And the military really likes to fight back when people protest. So it will be bloody and it won't be pretty. But we're here to help you understand the whole situation that is going on in Sudan right now. And it kind of forms the basis of understanding kind of instability in countries and how to explain that to your general audience in Extemp too. So I think this is going to be a juicy episode.
And it's actually kind of a good topic. One of the main reasons is you don't really get a lot of Africa topics just in general in Extemp. And kind of having an interesting topic in Sudan really is a great opportunity to learn about something that very, very few people know about. And I think in a lot of ways, this gives our state an upper edge for like out of state traveling with Extemp. But I think this is also good for a general audience, right? There's not a lot of people that hear a lot of news stories about Africa in general, or we're more associated with that like Middle East region. But once we get down, especially like Egypt and lower, we don't hear a lot about it. It's just blank from the news, even though there's always a lot that's happening in these regions. So I kind of want to explain what's really going on and kind of more of like the political science point of view rather than a like full in-depth background. I think YuYu is going to do a little bit of a better job here than I am, but I have a very good understanding of what's happened more recently. And what's happening in Sudan is actually what is called transitional justice. I've mentioned this before in a previous episode about what transitional justice is, etc. This is a really good case of it and may actually be my final college paper. We're just talking about that earlier. There's actually a lot of really good information that pertains to this. So transitional justice, in essence, is a form of justice that looks to ensure a change in society from war to peace or from authoritarianism to democracy. So, in essence, what happened in 2019 was Sudan was able to establish a democracy after years upon years of protests, and they went from what was a dictatorship to a democracy. And sometimes we phrase that as a repressive regime to a successor regime. And that's exactly what's happened within this country. A lot of African nations in recent years have gone through this process. This is not just unique to Africa, or not just unique to Sudan. And there's just so many places that have gone through this system and are experiencing a form of trying to find a way to transition successfully. And right now, they're currently going through this system. But transitional justice is not perfect. There is no such thing as a perfect system in the first place. There are many methods to ensure a transition from what a society deems as a repressive regime to a brand new successor regime. And this is an example of a flaw that exists within different types of regime changes. The coup that's occurring is a big threat to a successor regime. And people who study transitional justice note that this is a problem that can occur when a society is trying to transition successfully. And we'll explain how we can typically fix this problem later down in this episode. There is a way to deal with this. But the coup that is happening is actually a threat to derail the change to democracy from a previous repressive regime. So Sudan's military, in essence, is going out and trying to flip what they have created as a brand new democracy back to its original parties that had complete control in Sudan. And this is very dangerous for a transitioning society, because if transitional justice fails, then what happens is a coup or a military threat can and will gain more attraction from the people that are within its country. And that leads to Sudan to being a very big topic right now in terms of watching how justice is actually perceived after a time of conflict from a repressive regime. What did Sudan use to transition from its previous regime to a brand new successor regime? And the answer is that the transition phase is not actually complete yet. But they are pursuing two different approaches. The first one is through the method of prosecution. This is seen through the conviction of the longtime dictator of Sudan, Omar al-Bashir. He was removed, jailed, and then convicted of corruption. That is prosecution. That's very similar to a normal justice system prosecuting people for their crime. And this isn't just the president or the original dictator. There are other people that are in the prosecution phase. But Sudan is also pursuing right now the International Criminal Court. Now, the ICC is a pretty notorious figure for being involved in African countries when it comes to transitioning societies. As a matter of fact, the ICC has been explicitly focused within African countries. It's based in Europe. I don't entirely remember where the ICC is off the top of my head, but they've done a lot of involvement with this, and Sudan is looking toward going toward the ICC to try to formulate a way to create a successful transition from their previous dictatorship to a brand new successor regime. And the ICC has been relatively successful in Africa. It's not a completely perfect system. It's what a lot of people expected from an international court that can do criminal charges, but there are a few fatal flaws within it. The first one in particular is the fact that it was rushed. In essence, the idea of creating an international criminal court existed after World War II, because of the extreme crimes that happened during the time. The world felt like it was important to establish a court that can prosecute for extraordinary crimes that happened, of putting the Jews in concentration camps, of committing mass amounts of genocide. And the idea of coming up with this kind of court was established after World War II. the problem is it never happened because the Cold War took place. And then the Cold War went on and on and on and on. And now the International Criminal Court came after the Cold War when countries decided we have to do something about this. And in essence, it got rushed. And that's the biggest flaw with the ICC is, in theory, the International Criminal Court is actually very good. And truth be told, it has its successes when it comes to being able to fix societies that are in need of change. But for the most part, the ICC is something that needs to really establish itself. And I think the case of Sudan is a really good example of it. And we'll explain why a little later down the road. As the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace explains, their former dictator and his chief lieutenants are facing war crimes that will probably inevitably lead them to trial at the ICC. And once again, the purpose of the International Criminal Court is there to prosecute via war crimes and to help a society effectively transition from their previous period of time. So its goals and its intentions are very good to try to successfully change a society from its previous repressive regime to a successor regime. But these systems are not perfect and they have many troubles. The biggest one is actually being able to prosecute both sides. What do I mean by both sides? We'll mention World War II again. Okay. Thinking about World War II, for example, the Nuremberg and Tokyo trials were particularly in favor of the United States and the people who, quote, won the war. There wasn't really any recorded history because of this of the war crimes that the United States committed during World War II, or any of the other countries that, in essence, won World War II. There were still war crimes and extraordinary crimes committed by the United States and by other countries in World War II, but those crimes were not prosecuted from. And to have an effective transition phase, both sides have to become prosecuted. And this is a situation that, in my honest opinion and in my research with transitional justice throughout this course at the University of Wyoming, Sudan is a really good situation to see transitional justice be effective. And if transitional justice actually was to prosecute both sides, I think that this coup would be in favor of having a democracy in place. So kind of looking at the Nuremberg and Tokyo trials, we can see the same situation when it comes to Sudan. The coup right now is trying to destroy democracy within Sudan. However, there is an important point to note. The period leading up to democracy could also hold war crimes or extraordinary crimes that exist from the people who are deemed as victors. So, and YuYu, kind of like in this general essence, we can see that the side that has the positive in this, and hooray, we're at democracy, they can have their people tried as well. And if we were to have an effective change to a society, then the ICC or another form of transitional justice is also going to take action toward the victors in this essence.
Yeah, and I think honestly, if like both sides kind of take responsibility for what has been done, it is very much likely that we can actually transition into a democracy for Sudan, and that Sudan can like finally gain some sort of stability and some sort of peace without the corruption in the past decades that they've experienced that. But there are a lot more kind of specifics and details that we should also take note of before we kind of make any conclusions from this. And that is, I guess, what I'm here to explain to y'all. So Sudan was in the process of transitioning into a Western model of democracy with elections to put officials into power and a creation of a constitution. That election was going to be held in 2023. And prior to 2023, they agreed to kind of have like a transnational government where it was split power between the military of Sudan and also the civilian coalition that was led by Prime Minister Hamdok. However, it is also good to note that just a brief history before any of this was happening was the former president of Sudan, Omar al-Bashir, was kind of taking Sudan into very interesting places. And what I mean by that is that there was just a lot of corruption, a lot of repression, a lot of the citizens didn't gain what they wanted and they protested in the streets. Those protests were being repressed by al-Bashir, and eventually the citizens had enough and he was finally ousted. At the moment, they're trying to put him through a trial through the ICC, as Spencer explained, and we will see where that leads. But after those 30 years of rule, it is safe to say that there is a lot of conflict that is going to be happening. And this is where we see it now, as with like the coup. You can imagine there's been a lot of backlash against the General Albaran, who led the coup with the military, and just backlash in general towards the civilian coalition, but also Sudan. But before we dive into that, it's good to note that Sudan's transition into democracy has been very rocky generally. That's because the relationship between the Transitional Military Council led by al-Burhan and the civilian coalition group led by Prime Minister Hamdok was very tense. There was a coup before the one in October, allegedly staged by al-Bashir royalists. The military accused the civilian coalition of not doing enough to address the dire economic situations in Sudan, which basically means that they accuse the civilian coalition of allowing the coup by al-Bashir royalists to come into fruition. But then the civilian coalition and also civilians in general accuse the military of preventing progress towards democracy. There's a lot of tension between the military and the people of Sudan just because it reminds them of the time when Omar al-Bashir was in power. There were protests that erupted out of this before finally al-Burhan detained coalition leaders and Prime Minister Hamdok and declared Sudan a technocratic state, meaning Sudan would be ruled by an elite of technical experts. So in this case, it would be the military or generally whoever they favor. Al-Burhan was promoting the rhetoric that the coup was necessary to avoid a civil war that was brewing in Sudan. While it kind of seems like there was a civil war that was brewing, this wasn't technically true. The tensions that existed were between his motivations to kind of grab power, stabilize the country, and the coalition that was preventing that from happening. I low-key think he's a very arrogant leader. Just from my readings, he really thinks of himself as like the steward of the people that can like offer them a stable solution, and he's the one that's going to lead them to stability and peace and stuff like that. I know generally like all leaders probably think a little bit like this, like, oh, I'm the one that's going to bring so much happiness to the people and so much justice. But sometimes that kind of rhetoric can be taken a bit too far, as we've seen in this case. The Sudanese people fought back against the coup, not surprisingly, as they really wanted to transition into stability, whether that be democracy or not. But overall, they wanted democracy and really wanted it to succeed. So this is why there are so many protests in the streets, and especially protests that are youth-led. They don't really enjoy the military being in power, and they don't like the fact that it was a military coup. Most of the rhetoric that the people are promoting is simply, hey, we have survived other coups before and we will like survive past you, we will persevere. Part of the reason why al-Burhan, or at least military leaders, were motivated to start this coup in the first place is because they thought countries in the region like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and etc. would turn a blind eye to this because those countries really don't have the greatest track record in terms of promoting democracy. But let's talk about the international community's reaction to this as well. Well, at least probably just the community in the region. The region that I'm referring to is the Horn of Africa, which is inclusive of Ethiopia, Egypt, Sudan, and more countries. This region has been experiencing a lot of instability. Not only do they now have to deal with the military coup in Sudan, but they also have to resolve the crisis in Ethiopia, where there was a civil war going on. There's a bunch of refugees fleeing to surrounding countries, and those countries really don't have the resources, nor do they have like the legitimacy or manpower to kind of support the refugees. Civil war is still going on. Furthermore, the African Union has suspended Sudan after further notice and has demanded the restoration of the civilian coalition, meaning Sudan can no longer make decisions or be a part of discussions with the African Union. Sudan is also working on normalizing relations with Israel. This started in 2020, initiated, I think, by former President Trump, but that has yet been resolved as it has been put on hold. And Israel doesn't really know what the coup means for Israeli-Sudanese relations, and that's what they've said publicly. There was also rumors, though, that Israel sparked some of the domestic conflicts within Sudan. They do have a pretty close relationship with Sudan's military, so it's not impossible. It's just really hard to prove. So do with that what you will. Maybe not true, maybe true, who knows? But most likely, Israeli and Sudanese relationships will continue to persevere. Whether or not they will be normalized with Sudan in general or just the military is yet to be seen. The US is also very worried about the potential damages that could be done with the coup. They had hopes that things were going to, I guess, smoothly transition to a democracy because things really looked at that way, and the citizens' responses was kind of directed us into the thought process that they were actually going to transition. But turns out that wasn't the case. We had a delegate sent to Khartoum, Sudan's capital, days before the coup, and once the delegate landed in the US, news of the coup shocked everyone. What the coup does to the US is it threatens the influence we have in Sudan and also in the Horn of Africa. Mainly, the US fears that this would spark more coups in the region and instability, decreasing any sort of formal relations or positive relations that they want to form with those countries. Now, the US has been trying to get Saudi Arabia on their side and kind of tell Saudi Arabia and also Israel to help get Sudan under control and also pressure the military in Sudan to step down. They have also suspended $700 million in aid to Sudan, too. The UN Security Council has also demanded that Al-Burhan reinstate the civilian coalition and release Prime Minister Hamdok along with officials. And the World Bank has also suspended their efforts into helping Sudan relieve their debt pressure. And now kind of just to contextualize the situation that is happening in Sudan in terms of affecting the citizens, it's not a pretty sight at all. With these protests that are going on, the military is obviously fighting back, and they have resolved to using violent means to suppress these protests, meaning people have already died because they were shot dead by the military, or they have been really injured because of repression tactics by the military. Another thing is because the US has suspended $700 million in aid, the UN Security Council is also suspending aid, and the World Bank is no longer helping them relieve their debt pressure. Along with COVID-19 hitting their economy really hard, their economy is still in a dire situation. It's not fixed. People don't have the resources that they need, and people are not happy, nor are they having the best time of their lives right now. So really, Sudan is a chaotic mess, but they're trying to figure things out, and really what will happen to Sudan, we will see in the next couple of months or in the next couple of years, honestly.
Absolutely. And truth be told, like kind of moving up into this situation that Sudan finds itself in, it is a fairly like new topic of discussion too, to where even though this is something that's been in progress for the last 2 years, there's really not a lot of like good effective background information yet on a topic that is so as complex as this is. We understand what happened before, and we understand that they're currently in the process of transitioning, but in the midst of a process of transitioning, a whole coup came and took place, right? And that's a that to a lot of people is a effective issue when it comes to a successful democracy. And I think that leads us perfectly into the question that we have this week. We actually have pulled this question from the NSDA. So this is a real question that people can see in rounds. So our extempers, we know that this is a question that, especially in the state of Wyoming, they like to pull questions directly from the NSDA on occasions. This is a very good example of one that you will see, and it will be worded exactly this way, or at least pretty close. And that question is, will Sudan's transitional government survive until the 2023 elections? And as you noted, 2023 is the next time that Sudan is going to have a, like, well, I believe this will be its first like legitimate democratic election. So kind of a big deal. If a successful democracy is in place, it's got to have a democratic election. But with how the coup has been in Sudan, it does question of whether or not there will be an effective transition phase and if that transitional government will last. We'll start with YuYu.
Yeah, so I think the most obvious answer that most extempers or even you guys might choose is no, that they will not have, or like the transitional government will not survive until the 2023 elections. And that's same with the coup that happened. There was a transitional government, and that power was split between the military and the civilian coalition. But then the military decided that the civilian coalition wasn't doing enough, and they had to take matters into their own hands to unite the people of Sudan. So that necessitates a no. Just because, the transitional government failed to kind of keep up what they were doing. However, I will note that this doesn't mean the elections won't happen. So it kind of makes like answering this question a little weird. Because did the transitional government kind of fail in terms of like keeping the peace between these two powers in Sudan? Yes, but does that mean that transitioning into democracy will not happen, or maybe having elections in 2023 will not happen anymore? Not necessarily, because the military's goal, or as they've stated so far, is that they do want peace and stability within Sudan. And the reason why they partnered with the civilian coalition was because, they had similar goals of finding stability within Sudan, et cetera, et cetera. And that's why they partnered together to kind of maintain that peace and stability until they could hold elections in 2023 to kind of transition them into a democracy. However, I guess this is also good to note that now with Al-Burhan kind of being the leader of the pack and dictating where Sudan is going to go politically, elections are up in the air. But for now, he thinks the best way to move Sudan forward is to implement a technocratic governmental system until things become more peaceful, or maybe until forever, and there'll never be like democratic elections. So I will say like the easiest answer is no, just with all of the literature out there saying that like there's a coup, it is jeopardizing democratic progress. The transitional government is no longer really structured anymore, and it kind of gives you very Omar al-Bashir vibes. And like just for context, Omar al-Bashir did kind of take power through a military coup in 1989, and that wasn't through an election, it was through a coup. So if you read anything, I think I saw an article that said like he was elected if he was not elected president, I would be very, very like weary of that source. But it is a really easy way to say no to the question if that was the direction that you're going. But I think Spencer has other thoughts for this too.
I definitely do. So I do think in general, no is the easy route. Kind of in more of a study, like examination, and resulting back in the thought of transitional justice itself. I think the answer to this is actually yes. And the reasoning for that is successor regimes, just in general, have it's very difficult. It's very, very hard to have a successor regime. And we could look at this in 100 different scenarios. You could talk about South Africa after the midst of apartheid, or something that happened in Sudan a while ago, which was Darfur. There are so many different examples of how hard it is to have an actual successful state of transition. Okay. And this is a prime example of something that is very difficult, right? But what happens with successor regimes is they have to be willing to listen to all parties that want to be on the table. So part of that is what they want to have for their democracy. And in this essence, what the old party in this what would be the military coup right now, what they want to bring to the table in democracy. And they also have to consider international factors. Sudan's military has a big tie with Israel, as you had just mentioned, which means that Israel kind of has a say in there. And they take all of these factors and come up with some kind of answer. Okay? And that's how a successor government works. It's going to take time. And that's something that is really difficult to like examine. If we were to really look at like in truth with democracy here, 2023 with transitional justice is a pretty fair amount of time to see a transitional democracy or transitional government last, right? Or the new government, it was established in 2019. It goes to 2023. That's 4 years. The bigger question is it going to last until 2027 or 2031? And I think that's the real, because if we're noting every 4 years based kind of off 2019 to 2023, that's maybe the bigger question. Because the thing that has to happen first is how Sudan goes through the ICC. And if the ICC is actually willing to take both sides or willing to find a way to have all parties viewed as equal, with this being the path that this country wants to take, if this is to occur, then Sudan is going to be in good shape if they're willing to listen to all parties and look at all forms and all visions of crime that have been committed in the lead up to this democracy. Then this would actually be very successful, and there is no doubt it's going to stay till 2023. If the ICC, on the other hand, doesn't do that, I still think it's possible that it goes till 2023, but I don't think it will be very long past that, because that will gather more support for the coup and, in essence, maybe create a new successor democracy government, or back to the old ways. And that's just being completely reasonable here. It really depends on how they go about this phase here. And this transitional phase is extremely important for Sudan. And I think that's probably the biggest takeaway from this episode in particular is this phase right now, the coup that's going on, really tells us whether or not Sudan is going to be an effective democracy. And if they take this transition phase seriously, if they are willing to hear what the coup wants for their own country, then Sudan can be a very successful democracy. But if they ignore the coup, if they let the coup continue to have this like uprising and like propose a lot of danger to its people, to where more violence is committed, more war crimes or extraordinary crimes come into play, we would be in another situation where this becomes kind of out of hand, and there's no doubt that there won't be an effect, that this won't be an effective democracy and if or an effective transition. I think kind of just generally speaking, the coup is a good indicator of the society needing to work with the older party to find out how they want the successor regime to go. And if they do that, this works. But that's the big if. So when asked this will question, we really want to know if this justice is going to be effective and if the government really takes this seriously. And I don't know about you here, but I really think cooperation with the coup actually fixes this problem.
I think like you said, it is a big if, and whether cooperation with the coup will actually happen, or whether the military coup, or like the people who did the military coup, wants to cooperate with the international community, or wants to like cooperate with um, the civilian coalition again, like the international community wants them to, will be dependent on what happens next. Will they find the pressure of not receiving aid, not receiving debt relief, not receiving, like a whole bunch of these things that kind of Sudan was dependent on for their transition? We will see if they cave into that pressure and like finally work with the civilian coalition again to kind of create a sort of governmental system that they're both happy with. But for now, I guess I should have like prefaced this before we answered the question. This question, the purpose of it was to kind of just like evaluate the transitional government that was forming before the October 25th coup. So in its basic form, the answer is no, because we saw the coup happen, transitional government kind of like shattered. So say no, but also with these kind of questions, it doesn't necessarily restrict you to a no. You can kind of experiment with it and be like, even though it is a no, there's a chance that this can happen. And like another thing I want to point out with this question is it's a will question and it's not a can question or a should question. More so like if it was a should question, it would be a little different because it's kind of like, should Sudan actually cooperate with the two differing parties and like form a government and then get to the elections in 2023? Like, yeah, obviously, but will they do that or can they do that is like a different thing. And that's something that extempers should take note of too. Always look at the words that the question is using because it can tell you to do different things. If it's a should, it's not a whether they can or they will. It is more so that like a moral type question. If it is a will or can, it is more so what is the reality of the situation? Is this possible? Like what are the chances of this happening? What is the uh, kind of situation that will take precedence over the other? That's what will questions will usually indicate.
And to kind of jump on that, there's always three things you look for in a question. The first one is the will, can, should, etc. How should or what should are different than just regular should, because they do ask you for a more in-depth like solution. The second one is you want to know the actor. Okay? And sometimes we forget about that. So when it comes to, you want to know the actor and what is being acted upon. Okay? And if we forget those when it comes to just asking a regular question, then sometimes we forget exactly what our purpose is of answering the question, right? So you have will, should, how should, what should. In this instance, you have will, okay? And the actor here is, the actor in this question is Sudan's transitional government, and what's being acted upon is the 2023 elections, right? So that's what you have to kind of like pay attention to when it comes to the wording of these questions. And sometimes they do like to throw questions out that have that backwards. Something like along the lines of how will how would you word this that was backwards? There's a way to do it too.
Um,
Will the 2023 elections
happen.
exist after Sudan transitional government? Something like that. And they're willing to word it in backwards ways that you have to pay attention to, right? What's being acted and what's being acted upon are imperative to questions and imperative to answering them, because sometimes you can get a question that involves the United States plus Israel plus Sudan, right? Um, and we're throwing that out there because we saw a question that was like that and threw it out of this video because it was really bad. And had a lot of moving parts. It had a lot of actors. It wasn't really clear what was being acted upon, in essence. And we just want people to be aware of that, especially when it comes to like questions that are being worded.
Yeah, and I think like when in doubt, if the question is super duper confusing, most likely your judge probably won't understand the question, and in which case you have the freedom to frame your answer in a particular way that still addresses the question, but in a way that makes more sense and that you understand. Like a good example of that for this question would kind of just be like, okay, here's the question. The transitional government did fail, but that doesn't necessarily mean the 2023 elections won't happen. And like that's a route that you can go in which Spencer's answer would fit perfectly into that type of framing. And this is something that you would mention before your speech. So it would just be like in your introduction. Um, or it might just be like, yeah, it might just be that sentence as like your thesis statement, like Spencer talked about in a previous video. So I guess my biggest advice for you to take away from this video would just be like, pay attention to the question and figure out a way you want to frame it.
Absolutely. You can take that information that you just said, use it as your thesis, or you could use that as a transitioning point to each of your, or to one of your points, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you got something like that that works kind of like, we call this we call an abstract argument as a transition. And basically walking into your first point, you can say something that's like along the lines of, because a transitional government in Sudan has already failed, that doesn't mean that the 2023 elections won't happen. Thus, the first explanation, blah 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 blah. Right? Hey, and that's actually a really effective transition. That gives you brownie points because first off, you didn't use just a transition phrase of first. It actually gives you an effective transition into your point, and we may have some more to talk about with that later down the road. We may or may not be planning on like holiday special of a whole bunch of really cool Extemp materials that I'm not totally revealing out loud right now. So don't tell anybody. But that's a really good example of a great like transitioning phrase because you can use a different thesis. with that and still be able to develop the point that you want. So I actually think we have a fairly short episode. This is probably a great place to wrap it up. Honestly, like, you guys get 20 minutes off today.
Well, okay. I will say, like, I think for me, I would put that transition at the end, or it would be my last point that I bring up. The first two would just explain how Sudan's transitional government failed, talking about the coup, talking about what's going on now, and kind of like the political turmoil in the country. And then finally, just being like, however, there is some hope. This doesn't mean that the 2023 elections won't happen. And kind of just like frame it that way. I think I was a really big fan of those speeches. I did them a lot. Like, it would be a really sad topic, but then I would be like, but wait, there's hope. There's light at the end of the tunnel, I promise. And then I would just kind of like explain that situation.
YuYu sounds like one of those commercials. But wait, there's more.
Yeah. Well, it makes it entertaining, I think, and like gives your judge some hope and like less doom and gloom about the world. But yeah, I agree. It's a great way to kind of wrap up the video. I think our international relations videos are really short, but that's fine. As always, if you all have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to DM me or DM Spencer. We are always checking our DMs. We will not shun you away if you ask us questions. Or if you feel comfortable, you can also post them in the comments down below on our YouTube channel if you're watching through the YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe, ring the bell so that you are notified every single time we post a new video, and you get the exclusive, because on our YouTube, we post it a day early than through the One Clap podcast. But yeah, we just recently celebrated our 10th episode. Thank you all who have been supporting our journey so far. It's a lot of work and it feels very good that it's kind of paying off, helping you kind of just learn more about Extemp and also feel more comfortable doing Extemp, which we have also heard comments about. So we really appreciate when you tell us that we are helpful, and so it feels like our work is not wasted. But I hope you get the one in the round. I hope you do well in the round. Tell us how you did. Tell us how we're doing. And with that, thank you so much for listening. We hope you tune in to the next episode.
And just for those who want to understand, I have mentioned this idea to YuYu. If you give, how about we go with a minimal amount? Let's go 10 likes on this video.
No, that's too little.
How about 15? We'll go with 15.
Okay,
we haven't had
20.
15 before. Okay, we haven't had
20.
15 before. We'll go with 15.
Fine.
Okay. We'll do a behind the scenes production. Okay, and kind of what I mean by that is, for those of you who don't know, it takes 12 days to actually put one of these together. It takes an extremely long time. We are very busy with college and with work, and then we spend 12 days to put one of these together. It's kind of crazy.
Putting that into context, it's not 12 days of constant research and work. It is 12 days of college work and then 1 day of rushing to put everything together.
Then,
but
there is kind of a process to it, and people should understand that it takes time and so on and so forth. So if you want a little behind the scenes look of what we do and so on and so forth, I think 15 sounds reasonable, because like I said, we haven't had it before. That sounds like a new milestone. That sounds pretty cool to me. But yes, thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, obviously leave a like, hit that comment, hit those comments down below. Hey, subscribe, that must be Italian. Those people who know that reference, let us know in the comments. And until next time, we will see you all later.